In the heart of Maplewood, Sheriff Tom Reynolds was the embodiment of law and order. His presence commanded respect, his decisions rarely questioned. The townsfolk trusted him implicitly, believing their safety lay in his hands. His daughter, Emily, was the town's pride, a dedicated schoolteacher with a warm smile for everyone. Their bond seemed unbreakable, a testament to family values in this close-knit community. But beneath the surface of this idyllic facade, shadows gathered. Unbeknownst to the residents, secrets festered within the Reynolds household. Emily's sudden and tragic death sent shockwaves through Maplewood, leaving the community in mourning and disbelief. As the investigation unfolded, whispers of hidden truths began to emerge. Allegations of embezzlement and corruption pointed fingers at the very man sworn to uphold justice. The lines between protector and perpetrator blurred, casting doubt on everything the town believed in. How far would a father go to protect his reputation? Could the pillars of the community be built on lies? Join us as we unravel the tangled web of deceit, betrayal, and the quest for truth in Maplewood. If you're captivated by stories that challenge perceptions and reveal the darkness lurking behind closed doors, like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. Stay tuned for more true crime stories that delve into the complexities of human nature and the pursuit of justice. Tom Reynolds had spent over 2 decades wearing the badge, patrolling the streets of Maplewood with a quiet authority that few dared to question. He wasn't just the sheriff, he was the foundation of the town, a man whose word carried weight, whose presence alone could settle disputes before they even began. People believed in him. They believed in his judgment, his fairness, and his commitment to keeping their small town safe. His reputation was untouchable. His name was synonymous with justice. And then there was Emily. His only daughter. The light of his life. From the time she was a child, Tom had made sure she understood the values of discipline, respect, and responsibility. She grew up under his watchful eye, never stepping too far out of line, always aware of the expectations placed upon her as the sheriff's daughter. But Emily wasn't just known as Tom Reynolds' little girl, she had built a life of her own. She was a teacher, the kind who knew every student by name, who stayed late to help the one struggling, who never turned away a child in need. She was loved. Admired. Safe, or so everyone thought. Then one night, everything changed. A single phone call shattered the illusion of peace in Maplewood. Emily Reynolds had been found dead in her home. The details were hazy, but the initial reports suggested a break-in gone wrong. The news spread fast, and the town, still trying to process the shock, turned to the one man they trusted most to bring justice, the sheriff. But something was off. The way Tom handled the case didn't sit right with some people. His reaction was controlled, almost too controlled. The crime scene was quickly sealed off. A suspect was identified within hours. An outsider. A transient man with no ties to Maplewood, the perfect scapegoat. It seemed open and shut, but those paying close attention noticed the gaps, the unanswered questions. The case moved too fast. The pieces didn't quite fit. Then came the rumors. Whispers about Emily's last days. People remembered how she had been acting different, distant, preoccupied, almost nervous. Her best friend, Linda Harper, recalled a conversation just a week before her death where Emily had hinted at something she had discovered, something she wasn't sure how to handle. Emily never got the chance to say what it was. Deputy Mark Stevens, a longtime member of the department, had always been loyal to Tom. But even he couldn't ignore the strange inconsistencies in the case. The sheriff's refusal to consider other suspects. The rushed evidence collection. The way certain details seemed to be swept under the rug before anyone could question them. And then, there was the way Tom spoke about Emily's death. Not like a grieving father, but like a man desperate to control the narrative. A few people started asking the wrong questions. Why was there no sign of forced entry at Emily's house? Why had the sheriff personally taken charge of the evidence instead of allowing the usual process? Why had Emily's belongings been removed from her home so quickly, before investigators could thoroughly examine them? And most importantly, what had Emily known before she died? Then, an outsider stepped in. A state investigator, called in quietly by those who weren't satisfied with the sheriff's version of events. At first, Tom seemed cooperative. He played the part of the grieving father seeking justice. But behind the scenes, he was watching, listening, making sure he stayed one step ahead. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the truth became. Emily had uncovered something. Records buried within the department's files. Money missing from town funds. A pattern that stretched back years, always covered up, always explained away. But this time, someone had found the cracks in the foundation. And that someone was his own daughter. Tom Reynolds had spent his entire career shaping the image of an upstanding lawman. To the people of Maplewood, he was more than a sheriff, he was a symbol of stability, the kind of leader small towns clung to. Decades of service had solidified his place as a man of honor, the one who showed up first at a crime scene and left last, ensuring justice was done. But for all his public goodwill, there were things about Tom that no one ever questioned. His authority was never challenged. His word was law. Those who got too close to certain truths found themselves facing quiet consequences. A job lost, an unexpected relocation, a rumor that ruined their credibility. Few dared to push. Over the years, he had learned how to make problems disappear, how to control what people saw and what they didn't. But no amount of experience had prepared him for the problem that was his own daughter. Emily Reynolds had been raised in a house where rules were absolute. She understood expectations, knew her father's way of thinking. But unlike Tom, she was not built for deception. She had a kindness about her, an openness that made people gravitate toward her. She had grown up watching her father hold power in the community, but she had never truly seen the shadows it cast. That changed when she stumbled upon something she was never meant to find. Emily had spent the last few months of her life preoccupied, distracted in a way that worried those closest to her. Linda Harper, her best friend and fellow teacher, had been the first to notice. Emily had always been the kind of person who shared everything, small frustrations, dreams, worries, but lately, there had been something different in her eyes. Something unspoken. She would start sentences and stop herself. She would hesitate before answering questions. It was as if she was holding on to a truth too dangerous to say out loud. Then there was Deputy Mark Stevens, a man who had spent years at Tom's side, learning the job, following orders without question. He had never doubted the sheriff before. But the moment Emily's death became a case, something in the way Tom handled it didn't sit right. The sheriff took control of the investigation with a level of urgency that felt less like a grieving father seeking justice and more like a man desperate to steer the narrative. Mark had seen the crime scene. He had been there when the evidence was collected, or rather, when it was quickly wrapped up and pushed aside. The pieces weren't adding up, and for the first time in his career, Mark found himself questioning the man he had always trusted. Linda was the first to voice her suspicions out loud. She told Mark about the last conversation she had with Emily, how Emily had been afraid, how she had mentioned something about her father, about a mistake, about something she had uncovered that she wasn't supposed to see. But before Emily could explain, she had brushed it off, saying she would figure it out. That had been the last time Linda spoke to her friend. As the inconsistencies in the case grew harder to ignore, the authorities outside of Maplewood took notice. The town had always handled its own problems, its own investigations. But this time, the questions were too big to contain. Detective Sarah Mitchell was assigned to review the case, her arrival unannounced, her approach direct. She had no ties to Maplewood, no reason to trust Tom Reynolds' reputation. From the moment she stepped into the sheriff's office, she could feel the tension. People were loyal to Tom, but there was something beneath that loyalty, a quiet fear. The way officers avoided eye contact, the way files were handed over with hesitation. Sarah had seen cases like this before. Cases where the truth wasn't just buried, but carefully orchestrated to be forgotten. What she didn't know yet was just how deep this one would go. Emily Reynolds had always felt safe in Maplewood. It was a town where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors watched out for each other, where the biggest disturbances were usually high school pranks or bar fights on a Friday night. That's why, when news spread that she had been found dead in her home, the town didn't just mourn, they recoiled in shock. People whispered in diners, in church parking lots, on their porches. A crime like this didn't happen in Maplewood. It wasn't supposed to. Her body was discovered by a concerned neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, who had noticed Emily's front porch light still on well past midnight. It wasn't like Emily to forget something so simple. When her knocks went unanswered, and a feeling of unease settled in, she called the sheriff's office. Deputy Mark Stevens was the first to arrive. He let himself in through the unlocked front door, stepping into what should have been a familiar, ordinary home, but instead, he found chaos. The living room was torn apart, drawers pulled open, books and papers scattered on the floor. It looked like a robbery, messy and rushed. But something felt off. In all his years on the force, Mark had seen break-ins before. There was usually some sense of urgency to them, valuables taken, certain rooms ransacked more than others. This didn't look like that. This looked staged. Then he saw her. Emily was on the floor near the hallway, face down, her body still. No obvious signs of struggle. No clear indication of how she had died. Just the silence of a house that would never feel warm again. By the time Sheriff Tom Reynolds arrived, the crime scene was already secured. His face was unreadable as he stepped inside, but everyone in that house saw the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. He barely looked at his daughter before turning to Mark, issuing sharp orders: secure the perimeter, call in forensics, get statements from neighbors. He was in control, as he always was. But there was something else in his voice. Not just grief. Not just anger. Something colder. As the hours passed, the sheriff shaped the story the town would hear: a break-in gone wrong. A stranger passing through, looking for valuables, panicking when he was caught. A terrible, tragic accident. People believed it because they wanted to believe it. They needed a reason that made sense, something that fit into the safe world they thought they lived in. A suspect was named almost immediately, a drifter who had been seen around town in the days leading up to the murder. No real evidence pointed to him, but he was the perfect scapegoat. Someone who wouldn't be missed. Someone who wouldn't have the means to fight back. But as Mark watched the investigation unfold, doubt began to creep in. The sheriff was moving too fast, pushing too hard. Every question Mark asked, about the missing security footage from a nearby shop, about the inconsistencies in the timeline, was met with a curt dismissal. Evidence that should have been examined disappeared into sealed reports. The case was closing before it had even begun. Then Linda Harper came forward. She had been reluctant at first, hesitant to get involved. But she knew Emily. She knew that something had been weighing on her before she died. And there was one conversation she couldn't ignore, the last one they ever had. Emily had told her she had discovered something about her father. She hadn't gone into details, hadn't said the words outright, but Linda remembered the fear in her voice. The way she had gripped her coffee cup too tightly. The way she had looked over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. Emily had planned to confront her father that night. And now she was dead. Deputy Mark Stevens had been with the department long enough to know when something didn't add up. And from the moment Sheriff Reynolds wrapped up the case with a neat little bow, something gnawed at him. The transient suspect, a man named James Holloway, was found drunk behind an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of town. He had a record, mostly petty theft and vagrancy, and he'd been seen around Maplewood in the days leading up to Emily's murder. Sheriff Reynolds didn't waste any time. Within 24 hours of Emily's death, Holloway was in handcuffs, booked for murder. It all seemed too clean, too easy. Mark went through the crime scene photos again. If Holloway had broken in, why weren't there any signs of forced entry? Why hadn't anything valuable been taken? The house was a mess, but nothing was actually missing. Even Emily's purse, cash inside, sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Mark brought these concerns to Reynolds, who dismissed them outright. "It's open and shut," he said. "Let it go." But Linda Harper's words stuck with him. She'd been nervous when she told him about Emily's suspicions, looking over her shoulder like she was afraid of being overheard. Emily had found something out about her father. Something serious. And now she was dead. Mark couldn't let it go. The more he pushed, the more he realized the case had holes. The autopsy report was vague, listing cause of death as blunt force trauma but with no clear indication of what had inflicted the wound. There were no defensive injuries, no struggle, no fingerprints from the so-called suspect inside the house. And then there was the missing security footage. A nearby grocery store had cameras facing Emily's street, but when Mark went to request the tapes, he was told they'd already been collected, by Sheriff Reynolds himself. When he asked to see them, he was told they'd been lost. At this point, Mark knew he needed outside help. He reached out to Detective Sarah Mitchell, a state investigator with a reputation for catching things others missed. She arrived in Maplewood unannounced, immediately making waves. Unlike the local officers, she wasn't under Reynolds' thumb, and she had no reason to accept his version of events without question. She started from scratch, going over every detail, every piece of evidence that had been overlooked the first time around. It didn't take long for her to find inconsistencies. A partial shoe print near Emily's body that didn't match Holloway's. A smudged fingerprint on the doorknob that was never processed. And then there were the financial records. Detective Mitchell followed a paper trail leading straight to Sheriff Reynolds' office. It started small, misplaced funds here and there, unexplained withdrawals. But over time, the numbers added up. Tens of thousands of dollars missing from the town's budget, all leading back to Reynolds. It wasn't just a case of corruption. This was something much bigger. And Emily had found out about it. Detective Mitchell kept digging, piecing together a timeline of Emily's last days. She'd been acting strangely at work, distracted, nervous. Linda Harper recalled how Emily had mentioned something about her father that didn't sit right, something about missing funds, numbers that didn't add up. Emily had access to certain financial records through a local education grant program, records that connected directly to the town's budget. That's when she must have seen it, the discrepancies, the hidden transfers, money going places it shouldn't. She had confronted her father. Mitchell could see it clear as day. Emily was close to Reynolds, despite his strict demeanor, she had always been his pride and joy. She wouldn't have gone to the police or the press right away. She would have gone to him first, given him a chance to explain. Maybe she expected him to deny it, to laugh it off. Maybe she thought he'd tell her it was all a misunderstanding. But that wasn't what happened. The evidence pointed to a confrontation, one that had turned violent. Mitchell reviewed the coroner's report again, noting the detail Mark Stevens had questioned earlier. Emily had died from blunt force trauma, but there were no defensive wounds, no struggle. It was like she hadn't even seen it coming. Then came the staged break-in. It was sloppy, rushed. Drawers yanked open but nothing missing, a window cracked but no shards of glass inside. And the transient, James Holloway, a convenient scapegoat, someone no one would question. Mitchell checked the logs and saw that Reynolds had personally overseen Holloway's arrest that night, had taken it upon himself to drive out and pick him up. It was as if he had been waiting for an opportunity, or worse, creating one. She confronted Reynolds at the station. His reaction was immediate. He laughed at first, dismissing her claims. When she presented the financial records, the missing surveillance footage, the inconsistencies, his demeanor shifted. He leaned back, arms crossed, face hard. "Careful where you step," he said. Mitchell wasn't intimidated. She called in forensic experts to re-examine the evidence, ordered a review of Reynolds' bank accounts, and questioned officers who had been at the crime scene. Slowly, the town began to realize what was happening. The man they had trusted to protect them, the man who had worn the badge for decades, wasn't who they thought he was. The truth spread through Maplewood like wildfire. People whispered in diners, in grocery store aisles, on front porches. The sheriff had covered up his own daughter's murder. And the worst part? He might get away with it. The day Sheriff Tom Reynolds was arrested, Maplewood stood still. People gathered outside the station, whispering, staring. The man who had walked these streets with confidence, the man they had trusted with their safety, was now being led away in handcuffs by his own deputies. His face was unreadable, but his grip on his badge, which they forced him to remove, was tight. For the first time in decades, the town sheriff's office belonged to someone else. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters from nearby cities arrived, cameras flashed, and murmurs filled the air. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. They painted a picture of a man backed into a corner, a father whose carefully built life was about to collapse under the weight of his own corruption. Emily had discovered the truth, hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned from town funds, hidden beneath layers of forged reports and false approvals. She had confronted him, and for a moment, maybe just a moment, he saw her not as his daughter, but as a threat. The jury listened as the prosecution detailed how Reynolds had struck Emily, how she had crumpled to the ground, lifeless before she even had time to process what was happening. How, instead of calling for help, instead of trying to undo what had just been done, he had shifted into survival mode. Within hours, he staged the break-in, planted evidence, and manipulated his own deputies into making an arrest that fit his narrative. The defense tried to push back. They claimed there was no clear motive, that Reynolds had no history of violence, that it was absurd to think a father could do such a thing to his own daughter. They argued that the financial evidence was circumstantial, that Holloway, the transient man Reynolds had arrested, was still a viable suspect. But with every argument, the prosecution countered. Forensic experts testified about the staged crime scene, investigators laid out the missing security footage, and financial analysts unraveled the years of deception hidden within town accounts. Then came the testimony that silenced the room. Mark Stevens took the stand. The deputy who had stood by Reynolds for years, who had defended his decisions, now sat before the jury and admitted what he had suspected but never said aloud. He had doubted Reynolds from the start. He had seen the way his boss controlled the investigation, how he pushed the case to close too quickly, how his grief seemed more like calculation than loss. And then, the moment that sealed the trial, Linda Harper's testimony. Emily's closest friend, her confidant, the last person Emily had spoken to before she died. She recalled their conversation in detail. Emily had been scared, unsure of what to do. She had planned to gather more evidence, to take what she knew to the state auditor. She had said, "I have to tell the truth. No matter what." The jury took only a few hours to deliberate. When they returned, the entire town seemed to hold its breath. The verdict was read. Guilty. The weight of that word settled over the room like a heavy fog. The sheriff of Maplewood, the man who had once been their protector, was now a convicted murderer. And with that, the town's illusion of safety shattered, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth. The courtroom was silent when the judge spoke. The weight of the verdict settled over everyone like a heavy fog. Sheriff Tom Reynolds, the man who had sworn to uphold the law, was now at the mercy of it. The jury had deliberated for hours, but when they returned, their decision was firm. Guilty. The word echoed through the room, and for a moment, Reynolds didn't move. His face remained blank, as if he hadn't heard it. But the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the table in front of him, said otherwise. The judge began to read the sentencing. Life imprisonment. No chance of parole. The finality of it settled over the town like a slow, creeping chill. He would never walk free again. The man who had once been the highest authority in Maplewood was now just another inmate. Another name on a prison registry. Another cautionary tale. Some people in the courtroom wept, some for Emily, some out of sheer disbelief. Others stared ahead, too stunned to react. Linda Harper sat in the front row, gripping a tissue in both hands, her face pale. She had fought for this moment, yet now that it was here, she didn't know how to feel. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the loss. It didn't bring Emily back. Deputy Mark Stevens stood near the back, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He had spent years working under Reynolds, trusting him, respecting him. Now he would be the one leading the sheriff's office into a new era, one without corruption, one without secrets. But he knew the town wouldn't recover overnight. The scars of betrayal ran deep. As Reynolds was led away in handcuffs, he finally turned to look at the gallery. His gaze met Linda's, then Mark's, then the faces of the jurors who had sealed his fate. There was no plea for mercy, no final words of defiance. Just a long, empty stare before he disappeared through the door. Outside, Maplewood was still. People gathered on sidewalks, waiting, whispering. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, their cameras flashing, their voices blending into a low hum of questions and commentary. Somewhere in the crowd, an elderly woman shook her head, whispering, "I never thought I'd see the day." The town had its verdict. Emily Reynolds had her justice. But the sense of betrayal would linger, stretching through Maplewood like a shadow that refused to fade. The town of Maplewood would never be the same. Long after the trial ended, after the reporters packed up their cameras and the courthouse emptied, the weight of what had happened settled into the cracks of its streets, its homes, its people. It became one of those stories whispered about in quiet conversations, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. A reminder that trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. For years, Sheriff Tom Reynolds had been the backbone of this town. He had been the one people turned to in times of crisis, the man they believed in without question. But underneath the uniform, beneath the authority, was someone entirely different. A father willing to take the life of his own daughter to protect his own sins. A man who stood in court and listened to his crimes laid bare, only to remain silent. Emily Reynolds had died searching for the truth. She had paid the price for seeing something she wasn't meant to see, for questioning a man who had spent his entire life being unquestioned. Her death exposed more than a single crime, it revealed the dangers of blind faith, of power left unchecked. But this case didn't just shake Maplewood. It forced a larger question, one that lingers long after the courtroom doors have closed. How often do we look at those in power and accept their version of the truth? How much do we overlook because it's easier than asking the hard questions? How well do we truly know those we place our trust in? The story of Sheriff Tom Reynolds is a chilling reminder that even those sworn to protect can be capable of the worst betrayals. It's a case that will forever be etched in Maplewood's history, a scar that will never fully heal. But the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface. Justice was served, but at what cost? A father lost his daughter, a community lost its faith, and a legacy built over decades crumbled in an instant. The town that once stood behind Sheriff Reynolds now struggles to reconcile the man they knew with the monster he became. His name is now spoken with caution, his story a dark lesson in power, deception, and the length some will go to protect their secrets. Thank you for joining us in unraveling this harrowing tale of betrayal and justice. If you found this story compelling, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true crime narratives. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we delve into another perplexing case that challenges perceptions.